La 9533e séance du Conseil de sécurité est ouverte. L'ordre du jour provisoire de la présente séance est menace contre la paix et la sécurité internationale. L'ordre du jour est adopté. Conformément à l'article 37 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite le représentant de l'Ukraine à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite M. Adedeji Ebo, haut représentant adjoint pour les affaires de désarmement, à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 à l'ordre du jour. Et je donne à présent la parole à Monsieur Ebo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am providing this briefing on behalf of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, who is currently out of office. Almost 2 years have passed since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter. That represents 23 months of death, destruction, and unbearable suffering and devastation. In line with my previous briefings on this subject, over the last months, the provision of military assistance and transfers of arms and ammunition to the Ukrainian armed forces have continued. According to publicly available information, these transfers have included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions, small arms and light weapons, and their ammunition. In addition, there have been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles, and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, and that these weapons have been used in Ukraine. Needless to say, and as has been severally stressed by the High Representative, any transfer of weapons must take place within the applicable international legal framework, including relevant Security Council resolutions. Reports related to the transfer and use of cluster munitions throughout the conflict are very concerning. The Secretary General has repeatedly called for an immediate end to the use of cluster munitions. In line with this long-standing position, these weapons must be rendered inoperable and consigned to history. In addition, mines and explosive remnants of war have resulted in widespread land contamination, rendering land unusable for agriculture, while impeding the movement of people in Ukraine. States which are not yet parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions and to the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines, and on their destruction, should make all efforts to accede to these instruments. I also urge all the relevant parties to abide by their obligations under the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the use of certain conventional weapons, which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects, and not to transfer or use any mines prohibited by its amended Protocol 2. Mr. President, as has been stressed by the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, the large-scale influx of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict raises significant concerns for peace, security, and stability, including as a result of diversion and proliferation even after the conflict has ended. In laying out his vision for a new agenda for peace, the Secretary General calls on member states to take measures to address challenges related to diversion, proliferation, and misuse of conventional weapons at the regional, sub-regional, and national levels. As stipulated in Target 16.4 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, significant reduction of illicit arms flows can only be effectively achieved through strong cooperation and coordination by the international community. States have established a number of instruments, including legally binding ones, such as the Arms Trade Treaty and the Firearms Protocol, that should be fully leveraged to address risks of diversion and illicit trafficking. In addition, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its international tracing instrument also remain essential tools for addressing the illicit trade in all its aspects. The implementation of the recently adopted Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management will contribute to more effectively countering any diversion of conventional ammunition of all types and to preventing unplanned explosions at munition sites. I reiterate my call to all states to join relevant treaties and agreements and to fully implement their legal obligations under conventional arms control instruments to which they are party, as well as their political commitments to minimize the risk of diversion, illicit trafficking, and misuse of arms and ammunition. The Secretary General has unequivocally urged all states to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as such use is highly likely to result in indiscriminate harm to civilians, including in Ukraine and in the Russian Federation. I once again call on all member states to endorse and implement the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, EWIPA, adopted in November 2022 in a broad and meaningful manner. The upcoming EWIPA conference in Oslo in April 2024 provides an opportunity for more states to join the declaration and to commit to strengthening the protection of civilians. Mr. President, the steady stream of attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure remain seriously distressing. Allow me to repeat once again, unequivocally, all parties to any armed conflict have a duty to protect civilians in armed conflict and to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. This is an unambiguous obligation. From 24 February 2022 to 21 January 2024, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified 29,000 731 civilian casualties in Ukraine, with 10,287 killed and 19,444 injured. The actual figures are likely to be considerably higher. Let me say it again. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. All such attacks must stop immediately. Regrettably, the use of armed, uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles impacting civilians and civilian infrastructure continues, resulting in civilian deaths and injuries. Just like any other weapons or weapon systems, or armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the United Nations will continue working towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with international law, including the United Nations Charter and resolutions of the General Assembly. I reiterate the Secretary General's call to all states to do their part to prevent further escalation and to lay the foundations for sustainable peace. The only way to end the suffering and devastation is by ending this war. I thank you very much for your attention.
Je remercie Monsieur Ebo pour son exposé. Je vais à présent donner la parole aux membres du Conseil, en commençant par son Excellence Monsieur Sergei Lavrov, ministre des Affaires étrangères de la Fédération de Russie.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель, за предоставленное слово. Сегодня мы в очередной раз обсуждаем ситуацию на Украине в контексте сохраняющихся поставок в эту страну западного оружия, да и в контексте направления туда западных наемников, подтверждением чему стали недавно предпринятые нами меры по уничтожению французских наемников в Харькове. Только что мы услышали актуализированные данные от заместителя генсекретаря ООН господина прошу прощения, господина Эбо, от представителя заместителя генсекретаря ООН, благодарны ему за его информацию, за его рекомендации в адрес Совета Безопасности. Сегодня подавляющему большинству неангажированных экспертов совершенно очевидно, что ключевым фактором, препятствующим поиску путей мирного урегулирования украинского кризиса является продолжающаяся поддержка западного киевского режима, несмотря на его очевидную obviously in agony, and it is incapable of attaining the goal set to itself, namely to inflict strategic defeat on Russia, or, as is being said recently, to at least weaken my country. The reality is such that despite the complete failure of UAF on the battlefield, the Western patrons of the Kiev regime continue pushing them, they're maniacal in this, they continue pushing them towards continuing with a senseless military confrontation. And this is done under the guise of false words, saying that the crash of the Zelensky regime would be an existential threat for the Ukrainians, and that Russia wants to subjugate them. Those who look deeply into the genesis of the Ukrainian crisis can see very clearly that such statements contain not an iota of truth. Russia began the special military operation in February 2022, and it wasn't against Ukraine, and it wasn't against the Ukrainian people. We are still linked by brotherly ties with them, and it's not a coincidence that after 2014, in Russia, almost 7 million Ukrainians were found salvaged there. We had to start the military operation against an overzealous criminal regime acting with impunity, who decided, despite many years-long efforts, the regime which decided not to reject war against their own citizens in the south and southeast of Ukraine, or to reject policy of total discrimination of Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are still a majority in that country. And the Zelensky regime did this not only in violation of the Minsk agreements approved by the Security Council, but also in violation of elementary principles of civilized society and how it should be functioning, and whilst grossly violating foundational human rights, including the rights of national minorities, which are enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. And the Western patrons of the Kiev regime, who were behind the institutional coup in Kiev 10 years ago, throughout this time not only did not rein in the leaders of the Kiev clique, but also, in addition, on the sly, under the guise of the Minsk agreements, continued arming Ukraine and preparing it for war with Russia. We know this for a fact to date, and this comes from the revelations by the people who participated that directly, who drafted and signed the Minsk agreements, who submitted them to the consideration and approval of this Council. The reason why the West conducted itself in such a cynical and criminal way is obvious. Washington and other capitals in the recent times have been stating it openly. And it is that without losing the lives of their own soldiers, the West is fighting Ukraine, fighting Russia using Ukrainians, fighting Russia, which needs to be cut down to size. President Biden even talked about this being a great investment, and other U.S. officials also mentioned this expression about wonderful investment, and the UK colleagues as well. In the attempt to get Congress to agree to the new aid package for Ukraine, the representatives of the current administration sound even more cynical. We know from what they say, for example, that 90% of the military budget, which is being given by the U.S. to the Kiev regime, remains in the United States as being used to develop the military industry of the country and to update the weaponry. The old, ancient junk is being used in Ukraine. Most of major Ukraine plants and factories, for example, those which are manufacturing lithium, have been sold to the Americans. And the arable lands are under an indefinite lease at very, very low prices. One very good example here is the Soros entity received black topsoil lands for the purpose of burying their Western chemical waste. Mr. Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States, emphasizes that continuing assistance to Ukraine is a guarantee of creating new jobs in the United States. It's as though he's talking not about financing a war which already resulted in hundreds of thousands of people's lives lost in Ukraine, but about a profitable business venture. The Europeans, and I'm referring to the common sense thinking part of that, the Europeans should wake up and understand that using the Zelensky regime, the United States are not only waging war against Russia, but they're also dealing with the strategic issue of drastically weakening Europe as their economic competitor. Washington undermined its energy independence, it's triggered dangerous crises tendencies in European economy and the social sphere. I'm not dwell too much even on the issue of the act of terror on the Nord Stream. The United States are blocking any attempts to conduct an honest international investigation of that, and current European leaders, in Germany first and foremost, are obediently silent. They have resigned themselves to this kind of public humiliation. At the same time, most of the members of the European Union continue obediently doing what Washington is telling them when they supply new weapons to Kiev. They're emptying their own arsenals, which will be replenished through buying what is manufactured by the American military-industrial complex. And the Europeans will be forced to find enough money for that. The death merchants are not put off by the fact that their weapons, including cluster munitions and depleted uranium weapons, are being used methodically, mercilessly, and intentionally, knowingly, to strike civilian infrastructure. This was the case during the strikes against residential areas in Belgorod on the 30th of December and yesterday against the markets and shops in Donetsk. The blood of dozens of killed civilians is on the conscience of those who's arming Zelensky, and is saying at the same time that the authorities in Kiev can themselves determine what the goals for their strikes will be. We remember how the Anglo-Saxons, without any military need for that, bombed Dresden in the February 1945. How relatively recently Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria were razed to the ground. And now they have very worthy successors for their barbaric terrorist methods. The long pumping by weapons of the corrupt Zelensky regime has one more dangerous aspect. The desire to get maximum benefit from the conflict is obvious because in Kiev the authorities are simply reselling some of Western weapons on the black market. You can find such announcements on the dark net. It's difficult to agree that this is being done without Western merchants because one hand washes the other. One of the most recent examples is the American M16 rifles, which could be purchased by anyone on the net in exchange for cryptocurrency. And of course, this is a kind of situation that terrorist groups avail themselves of. They get the weapons, these weapons go to Africa, Near East, and Latin America, and this once again brings in additional stability to the regions which are already unstable. This scandalous situation has reached such a scope that it's no longer possible to pass it over in silence. Even the United States has to officially acknowledge this problem. In the recent report issued by Pentagon talks about the diversion of weapons which had been intended for the Ukrainian armed forces, and the amount here is in excess of $1 billion, and I'm sure this is a modest assessment. 40,000 units of weaponry, including drones and grenade throwers, have not yet been accounted yet. It is my understanding that the American inspectors went to Kiev to take a look on the ground what the situation is, and I wish you every success. Mr. President, we have heard many times, and we'll probably hear today as well from our Western colleagues, the statement, disingenuous one, according to which that if Russia will stop fighting, the war will end, but if Ukraine will stop fighting, that Ukraine will end. The high echelons of the United States went even so far as to say that Russia would attack Poland, the Baltic states, Finland after that. There's lots of things that you can think up if you want to get money out of Congress and European parliaments. When you convince them of the need to continue supporting Ukraine to the detriment of their nationals down to the very last dollar and euro. Asking Russia to stop the special military operation, they understand very well that if this were that the Kiev regime would lick its wounds and then continue to try and eradicate everything that is Russian, everything that has existed this way for centuries, Russian culture, history, and religious identity, that is. The Zelensky regime would continue pushing something that's foreign for the people, namely rabid nationalism, and glorify those who, together with the Nazis, was destroying during the World War II hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma, Russian, Poles, and Ukrainians. The dictatorship would be strengthening, the fight with the opposition would continue in any kind of dissent, and there would be many more political prisoners. And Western democracies would continue just close their eyes to this spectacle and keep silent, the way they're doing now, even after a U.S. citizen, a journalist, Gonzalo Lira, was tortured to death in the prison of the Ukrainian Ukrainian security service, and his crime was that he was publishing objective materials which are critical of Zelensky. Has anyone in the West, especially in the United States, any official has said anything about this death? No. And the Western delegations today and the representative of the Kiev regime will probably not find the courage to comment on this yet another outrageous crime by Zelensky and his clique. Instead of that, we'll hear about Russian aggression and statements that the Kiev regime will be supported. And the lies and the cravenness of its patrons has shown very clearly in the underhanded stage performance in April in Bucha, and how numerous requests to provide us with at least the names of those who supposedly was killed by the Russian service personnel were left without any reaction. I've approached the Secretary General with this several times. There was no reaction. He is simply not allowed to even try and establish what the truth is, because the truth will show up the Western puppeteers. Now, what would happen if Ukraine were to stop fighting? Hundreds of thousands of people who are currently being hunted for in the streets, in bars and churches, and the intention is to throw them as cannon fodder to die to protect the Western geopolitical interests. Their lives would be spared. There are no Ukrainian people's interest in their war against Russia. They never existed. They are only interests of the Anglo-Saxons and their minions and the corrupt and criminal Kiev top leadership, which together with the West cover each other up. They're afraid that they will have to go after the end of the war. They stonewalled the Minsk agreements. They crushed in April 2022 a chance for peace when the United States and UK banned the conclusion of peaceful treaty. They do not want peace today. Despite the fact the Kievan regime only survives thanks to Western handouts, and this is something that's being said about the talking heads already. Most people in Ukraine are beginning to understand who their true enemy is and who have been threatening them with Russia through lies and trying to cancel our history. And this change in the consciousness is being seen in the social networks. Despite censorship, truth will out about how people live in Crimea and other territories reunited with Russia. And despite the predictions of the Kiev propagandists, Russia and Ukrainians live together in peace. New authorities are dealing with people's issues and not lining their pockets. And the contrast here is obvious. So that is why in Ukraine and the West, this information is being suppressed. It's dangerous because it shows how Russians and Ukrainians can and should live under conditions where the West is not allowed to interfere into the relationship between brotherly peoples and not to act as an old, as a colonizer and try to pit the two people against each other. And as brothers and good neighbors should, they will live after the end of this special military operation, which will implement its goals either militarily or peacefully. And we never gave up on the peaceful resolution. We're always ready to negotiate. Negotiate not about how to keep the leadership of the Kiev regime in place, but about overcoming the inheritance of a decade-long destructive looting of the country and violence against the people on removing the reasons for the tragic Ukrainian situation. Any other peace plans and formulas and platforms which the Kiev regime and its masters keep presenting have nothing to do with peace and are only used as cover to continue war and continue getting money from Western taxpayers. It is unfortunate that the UN Secretariat is risking its reputation when it participates in an absolutely surreal so-called Copenhagen format. All of these formulas are a road to nowhere, and the sooner Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels realize this, the better for Ukraine and the West. West, for whom the crusade against Russia has already created clear reputational and existential risks. My advice is to heed this and take notice of this before it's too late. I thank you for your attention.
Je remercie M. Lavrov de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de Malte.
Thank you, President. I also thank High Representative Eber for his informative briefing. Nearly 2 years ago, the Russian Federation, during its presidency of the Security Council, decided to violate fundamental principles of international law by launching a fully fledged war of aggression against its sovereign neighbor, acting thus in complete opposition with its duty to maintain international peace and security. Today's meeting is yet another attempt to rationalize the unjustifiable and seek to provide a narrative where the victim is the aggressor and the aggressor the victim. President, Malta condemns Russia's ongoing campaign of systematic airstrikes against civilian targets and critical infrastructure in Ukraine that began on December 29th. Just last week, it shelled the cities of Kharkov and Odessa, injuring at least 20 civilians. These relentless and inhumane attacks had destroyed civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, medical facilities, and life-supporting infrastructure. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law and are completely unacceptable. These attacks must stop. According to the UN Human Rights Office, the confirmed number of civilians killed since February 2022 has risen to more than 10,200, including 575 children, and more than 19,300 have been injured. The transfer of ballistic missiles, along with any other arms and related material from the DPRK and Iran to Russia, violates multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions, undermines the global non-proliferation regime, and inflicts further suffering to the Ukrainian people. We condemn these violations in the strongest terms and call for all parties to fully abide with all pertinent resolutions. President, adding to Russian drone attacks, shelling and destruction, several reports have shed light on Russia's systematic use of anti-personnel landmines and the use and transfer of cluster munitions in Ukraine. Malta echoes Secretary General's call for an immediate end to the use of these horrendous weapons, which have lasting and devastating impacts on innocent civilians long after the conflict ends. Russia's aggression has also exposed millions of Ukrainians to increasing risk of gender-based violence, trafficking, deportation, and exploitation, women and children being the most affected. Furthermore, underneath the physical repercussions of victims and survivors lurks the deeply rooted psychological trauma that will affect millions for years to come. Malta will continue to help Ukraine in the face of the humanitarian needs created by the Russian aggression. Malta also strongly supports all ongoing accountability processes and the important work of the International Court of Justice the International Criminal Court, as well as the essential mandate of the Register of Damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, and of the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, in ensuring the right to reparation for victims and Ukraine. To conclude, President, Malta reiterates that Ukraine has the inherent right to defend itself from the Russian aggression, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. It has the right to protect its citizens, its borders, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity, just like any other member of this organization. Once again, we reiterate the call for Russia to end its hostilities and withdraw its military forces, equipment, and proxies. The maintenance of international peace and security can only be ensured through a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Malte de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Chine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing earlier and welcome the presence of Mr. Lavrov, representative of the Russian Federation and the permanent representative of Ukraine at this meeting. The Ukraine crisis, by the looks of it, is becoming a protracted, complex one, which China finds regrettable and worrying, given the increasing number of factors contributing to insecurity and instability globally. Ending the Ukraine crisis, halting the hostilities, and restoring peace is felt more urgently than ever. All parties should work harder to that end. First, we must be committed to common security. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected, and security is indivisible. No country may attempt to secure itself at the expense of another country's security, nor can regional security be guaranteed by way of muscling up or even expanding a military bloc. The consequences of NATO's eastward expansion indicate that seeking so-called absolute security at the expense of other countries' security will only widen the security deficit and trust deficit. It will do nothing to make our world more peaceful and stable. In this regard, NATO would do well to learn its lesson. Russia and Ukraine are neighbors that cannot move away from each other even if they wanted to. Their respective legitimate security concerns should be taken seriously by each other. The ultimate way out of the conundrum lies in an effort on the part of both countries and other parties concerned to build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture guided by the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. Second, negotiations must be resumed as soon as possible. There are no winners in conflict or war. Peace cannot be achieved by feeding weapons into the battlefield, and prolonged fighting will only result in more civilian casualties. We urge compliance with international humanitarian law to the letter and effective protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We must remain highly vigilant about nuclear safety risks. Diplomatic efforts must not be abandoned or given up under any circumstances. We call for the prompt launch of direct engagement and stepwise resumption of negotiations with a view to forging consensus to end the hostilities. The international community and the UN should create enabling conditions to that end. Other parties should refrain from any unconstructive action or any irresponsible rhetoric. Third, humanitarian needs must be effectively addressed. With a high incidence of devastating attacks and civilian casualties, the destruction of infrastructure, and the inclement winter weather, humanitarian needs in conflict areas are on the rise, and the humanitarian situation is distressing. We support the international community and the humanitarian organizations in stepping up their effort to provide winter ensuring relief for the populations in the affected areas, improve humanitarian conditions on the ground, and head off a humanitarian crisis of a greater magnitude. Fourth, we must spare no effort to stem the spillover of the crisis. At a time when the Palestinian-Israeli conflict drags on and some hotspot issues are at the risk of flaring up, the world cannot afford to see further spreading of geopolitical clashes. At the same time, the global economy is slowing down. Developing countries are finding it even harder to achieve the SDGs on the 2030 agenda. And the negative impacts of the Ukraine crisis and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict have added snow to the icy cold global economy. Countries with significant influence should take a responsible approach, refrain from politicizing, instrumentalizing, or weaponizing the world economy, and should instead work together to maintain global food, energy, and financial security, as well as the stability and smooth functioning of industrial and supply chains. Mr. President, the Ukraine issue has got to where it is today as a result of a tangle of complex factors which deserve our serious reflection. If we look around, our world is beset with wars and conflicts, risks and challenges, bringing all manner of uncertainties and threats into international peace and security. Complex problems being complex, they defy simple fixes. Confronted with all these challenges, the ultimate solution is for us to work harder to build a community with a shared future for humankind, shape a world blessed with lasting peace and universal security. All countries should play their parts and work together in this direction. China will continue to stand on the side of peace and on the side of justice with a tireless effort for international peace and security. I thank you, Mr. President.
Remercie le représentant de la
I thank the
Chine de sa
representative of China
déclaration
for
et je
his
passe à
statement.
présent la
I now
parole
give
à
the
la
floor to
représentante
the
du
representative
Guyana.
of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Director and Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Adedeji Ibu, for his insightful brief. I took note of the concern expressed about the risks of the diversion of weapons and ammunition and the need to ensure that arms transfers comply with relevant disarmament instruments and UN Security Council resolutions. As a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty, the Conventions on Biological Weapons, Chemical Weapons, Cluster Munitions, and Anti-Personnel Landmines, among others, Guyana echoes this call for compliance with international law and international disarmament instruments and obligations. We share the view that the supply of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict situation has the potential to further escalate or prolong the violence and risks of diversion. We therefore urge that all transfers are transparent within international legal frameworks and have provisions for controls to prevent their irregular transfer. Mr. President, we are of the view that the only effective means of preventing any further escalation or instability in Ukraine and the broader region is to end this war. Its prolongation poses increasingly grave risks and consequences for all countries and global peace and security. As the Director Ibo reminded, estimates to date indicate that there have been almost 30,000 civilian casualties, including 10,000 who have been killed since the start of this war 2 years ago. The scale of current humanitarian needs in Ukraine remains quite vast, with more than 14 million people in need of multi-sectoral humanitarian assistance. Equally alarming is the fact that 4 million people, including nearly 1 million children, are still displaced within Ukraine, while over 6 million continue to live as refugees in neighboring and other countries. UNHCR estimates that close to $1 billion is needed to support the humanitarian needs in Ukraine and in host countries. These figures are staggering. As we call upon the international community to scale up humanitarian support. We urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict peacefully and with full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. War has no place in the world in this 21st century. It is time that we come together to end the hostilities and deploy the necessary resources to rebuild lives. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Guyana de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la République de Corée.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. Almost 2 years have passed since the Russian Federation began its illegal armed invasion of Ukraine, and now we continue to witness mounting civilian casualties, while the war's impacts continue to reverberate around the globe. My delegation has repeatedly expressed concerns about civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure inflicted by Russia's attacks. Indeed, our long-standing common principles, generally upheld by the international community and the UN itself, have been under attack as well. As the majority of UN member states have repeatedly affirmed, Russia's armed invasion of Ukraine, as well as its annexation of Ukrainian territories through the use of force, constitute serious violations of the UN Charter and international law. Russia's claims cannot justify its illegal invasion, nor the tragic humanitarian consequences the war has caused. Furthermore, Russia's use of DPRK's weapons are direct violations of multiple Security Council resolutions, as any arms transactions with the DPRK are prohibited by those resolutions, all of which were unanimously adopted and voted in favor of by Russia. Besides the North Korean ammunition that have been provided, short-range ballistic missiles supplied by the DPRK hit Ukraine on December 30th, January 2nd, and January 6th. Russia's use of North Korean missiles in Ukraine also has significant implications on global nuclear non-proliferation as well as on the Korean Peninsula. Since it is unprecedented that Security Council resolutions were violated so flagrantly and seriously by a permanent member of the Security Council since the sanction regime was established against DPRK in 2006, it is difficult to fathom the repercussions. The missile in question was a short-range ballistic missile which the DPRK claims to be capable of mounting nuclear warheads, and the flight range corresponds to the Korean Peninsula. It generates revenue for the DPRK, which is likely to be used to further the development of its illegal nuclear and missile programs. It could open the door for more arms sales to other states and non-state actors. What is more problematic for us is the probability that DPRK may receive, in return from Russia, something important for its military capabilities, in particular nuclear and missile-related technologies. My delegation is strongly concerned about the recent visit of the DPRK's Foreign Minister, Choi Sun-hee, to Moscow, accompanying a senior official in charge of arms development and production. It is alarming that they were carrying documents accidentally spotted by the media that indicated their interest in continuing DPRK military cooperation with Russia. Under this deeply troubling backdrop, it is distressing to see that such a blatant violation of multiple Security Council resolutions is being committed by none other than a permanent member of the Security Council. My delegation condemns the ongoing military transactions between Russia and the DPRK. In conclusion, Mr. President, my delegation strongly urges the Russian Federation once again to immediately withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and put an end to this brutal war. Ukraine's sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity should be respected. Ukraine's exercise of its inherent right to self-defense, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter, must receive international support and assistance. The Republic of Korea is firmly committed to working with the international community towards a lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter and the UN resolutions, and we will maintain our support for Ukraine in the areas of security, humanitarian affairs, and reconstruction. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Deputy High Representative Ebo, for your briefing. Mr. President, it is unfortunate that the Russian Federation continues to call for repeated meetings on this topic and use this council as a stage for its blatant disinformation, which we have unfortunately had to listen to this morning. It is cynicism of the highest order to claim that legitimate and lawful support for Ukraine's self-defense is prolonging Russia's war of aggression. It bears repeating. There are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. There is not a single Ukrainian soldier on Russian soil. The Russian representative's accusations would sound more credible if his government respected international law, the UN Charter, and Security Council resolutions. The UN Secretary General has reiterated on many occasions that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of the Charter and international law. No amount of conspiracy theories and baseless accusations erase the fact that Russia's violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity started this war. It is President Putin's single-minded pursuit of the obliteration of Ukraine and subjugation of its people that is prolonging it. Russia's imperialist designs are obvious, and this meeting is another effort to distract from its war crimes and aggression. It is an arsonist blaming the firefighters so it can continue its crime. As its invasion has faltered, Russia has sought more gasoline for its fire. It turned to Iran and the DPRK to procure additional weapons to use against Ukraine, its cities, and its people. Russian forces have now used against Ukraine DPRK-origin ballistic missiles acquired in violation of Security Council resolutions at least 3 times. Last year, the United States brought to light clear evidence of Iran's unlawful transfers of armed Iranian UAVs to Russia, despite restrictions in place at the time of this acquisition under Resolution 2231. These unlawful arms transfers and potential technology transfers from Russia to the DPRK undermine regional stability and the global nonproliferation regime. This Council must hold to account any country that undermines its obligations under UN Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, it is clear no country has paid a bigger price for Russia's aggression and wants peace more than Ukraine. The Ukraine-led peace formula meetings are a clear sign of continued interest from the international community in a just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter. Last week, more than 80 countries gathered in Davos for the 4th iteration of these meetings. Contrast these efforts with Russia, which speaks of an openness to dialogue while launching massive aerial assaults against Ukrainian cities. While Ukraine has been engaging in diplomacy with the international community, Russia has responded by launching missiles. Russia even attacked Ukraine while the Secretary General and an African peace delegation were visiting Kyiv. Don't just listen to Russia's words. Look at its actions. Russia can end this war today, but until it chooses to do so, the international community must continue to support Ukraine, the UN Charter, and the principles necessary to bring about a just and lasting peace. Russia must immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, cease its unlawful procurement of DPRK origin materiel, and meet its responsibilities as a member of this Council and the international community. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant des États-Unis de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to start by thanking the French presidency for convening this important briefing on Ukraine. I also thank Mr. Adedeji Ebo, Deputy to the High Representative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, for his valuable insights. Mr. President, despite repeated pleas for peace and multiple sessions of this Council on Ukraine, any plausible resolution remains elusive as we approach the 700th day mark since the conflict started. The persistence of hostilities is a clear indication of the shortcomings of our existing diplomatic attempts. It is critical that we find faster, more practical ways to help quell this Ukraine conflict and reach a sustainable settlement. Mr. President, as we stated repeatedly, the unchecked flow of weapons not only exacerbates the conflict, but also complicates any peace-making efforts. The involvement of multiple states in supplying arms to both sides of the conflict further complicates the international legal landscape and hinders diplomatic efforts. Regrettably, the ongoing flow of weapons reflects the prevailing military mindset among the belligerents who are convinced that their disagreement can only be resolved by force and military means. However, history has time and again shown that military solutions rarely result in lasting peace and often perpetuate a vicious cycle of bloodshed and humanitarian disasters. Experiences from various parts of the world, particularly from Africa, our own continent, shows that military victories are often Pyrrhic. Therefore, in order to achieve durable peace, the parties need a paradigm shift from the military force to that of genuine communication and sincere negotiation. They owed it to their people and future generations. Mr. President, as we enter 2024, we hoped for a course correction towards de-escalation and stability, which would have provided some breathing space for negotiations. Instead, this new year has seen heightened turmoil worldwide, reflecting our collective failure to invest adequately in resolving protracted conflicts globally. The Ukrainian conflict exacerbates instability and changes the nature of conflict far afield. The ripples can be felt even in Africa, posing significant challenges to the implementation of the Silence the Guns initiative. The Silencing the Guns initiative already contends with complex root causes of conflict like poverty, inequality, and political marginalization. Now it must also navigate an increasingly militarized global landscape. Moreover, the crisis impacts socioeconomic systems in Africa and beyond. Disruption in energy supplies have raised costs worldwide. Supply chain breakdowns and trade stoppage affect industries globally. African economies also suffer from financial market volatility and currency fluctuation. This illustrates how geopolitical shocks reverberate across continents, highlighting the interconnectedness of our socioeconomic systems. Mr. President, we have long advocated for dialogue and negotiation as the sole path to decisively end hostilities and build foundations for enduring peace. This approach aligns with the principle of peaceful conflict resolution upheld by various international bodies, including the United Nations. The emphasis on negotiation over military action reflects Mozambique's own experience and its commitment to the principle of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states. Conflict-building measures are critical in laying the groundwork for peace and ensuring the success of negotiation. The largest exchange of prisoners early in the year, mediated by the United Arab Emirates, is a prime example of such measures in action. To build on this momentum, further initiatives could include ceasefires, communication channels for crisis management, engagement in arms control measures, and opening up access for humanitarian aid. Mr. President, in light of the ongoing escalation, Mozambique urges the renewed emphasis on diplomacy to achieve peace in Ukraine. Finally, we firmly believe on open communication and mutual understanding to be the critical keys to a lasting peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci le représentant du Mozambique de ces déclarations et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Slovénie.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would also like to thank the Deputy to the High Representative Ebo for his briefing. Mr. President, let me focus on three messages that we would like to convey at today's meeting. First, on the arms transfers. We would like to state our deep concern over the military cooperation between Russia and DPRK, as well as Russia's import of DPRK ballistic missiles. These actions constitute serious violations of multiple UN Security Council resolutions and should be further addressed by the Council. Second, Russian Federation is waging a war of aggression against its neighbor. As simple as that. It's indeed cynical and quite audacious to wrap up own's aggression into concerns for European autonomy, for European taxpayers, for European soil, or for European civilians that you keep bombing. No, thank you. A number of countries, including my own, are responding to the request for help from Ukraine with one sole purpose: helping Ukraine to protect its citizens, helping Ukraine to defend itself on its own territory, in accordance with the right to self-defense of the Article 51 of the UN Charter. And we are looking for the day when Russia withdraws its troops, peace returns to Ukraine, and the two neighbors are able to coexist peacefully. Until then, we will be calling on the Russian Federation to stop the aggression and to comply with Helsinki Charter of 1975 on inviolability of European frontiers, and to comply with Article 2 of the UN Charter on refraining from the use of threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. Third, my country entered this Council with declared aspiration to contribute to building trust, peace and security whenever, wherever we can. The same international law, international humanitarian and human rights law that Russia Federation is applying to the situation in Gaza applies to Ukraine as well. We remind Russian Federation of its call against double standards. Thank you.
Représentant de la Slovénie de cette déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this briefing. Let me also thank the Director and Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Adedeji Ebo, for his briefing. Sierra Leone continues to express grave concern about the regrettable situation created in Ukraine by the war, with its serious ramifications for international peace and security. As already noted, this is based on our fundamental belief in the sanctity of the UN Charter, its principles, and the purposes of the organization. Accordingly, Sierra Leone has been consistent in expressing commitment to the Charter of the United Nations and respect for its principles and international law, including the principles of sovereign equality of all United Nations member states, the territorial integrity or political independence of member states, non-interference and peaceful settlement of dispute. As we have already outlined our principal position on the conflict in Ukraine in this chamber, including reiterating our call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, we have the strong conviction that the parties to the conflict, as well as the involved parties, must take meaningful steps towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. As noted already by our briefer, the UN Human Rights Office has verified that at the end of 2023, well over 10,000 civilians have been killed and more than 18,000 injured since the conflict in Ukraine began in February 2022. Over 10 million have been forced to flee their homes, including over 6.3 million who have sought refuge outside of Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has been going on for over 2 years without an end in sight and a seeming military stalemate. In this regard, Sierra Leone notes the Russian Federation's claim that Western arms transfer to Ukraine is prolonging the war and undermining efforts to resolve the conflict. Additionally, Sierra Leone also takes note of the claim by some members of the Council that the Russian Federation is receiving arms from sanctioned member states in violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. Sierra Leone is of the firm view that the supply of weapons in any armed conflict creates risk of escalation and diversion of resources, particularly from socio-economic development. This has been demonstrated in the Ukraine conflict with the increase in the death toll and the massive destruction of civilian infrastructure over the past 2 years. Sierra Leone therefore calls for measures to prevent the diversion of ammunition and weapons, such as pre-transfer risk assessment and end users verification, to help to support conflict prevention and post-conflict recovery, among other things. Sierra Leone condemns any form of illicit transfer of weapons and reiterates that any transfer of weapon must take place within the applicable international legal framework. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is not improving, and we have previously stated in this Council that over 14.6 million people, about 40% of the Ukrainian population living in Ukraine, will need humanitarian assistance in 2024. In our view, the focus in Ukraine conflict should be threefold. First, seeking an end to the conflict. We therefore call on the parties to the conflict to cease hostilities and engage constructively in order to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. Second, addressing the dire humanitarian situation, especially in Ukraine. This cannot be fully addressed if fighting is ongoing. With no end to the conflict in sight, destruction of life and property will continue on both sides of the conflict in a vicious cycle of violence. Third, avoiding a nuclear disaster. With fighting ongoing in and around nuclear facilities and plants, there is no denying the potential of these facilities being hit by a projectile from either side in the conflict, which in turn will lead to a situation no one in this Council is willing to ever contemplate. Let me close, Mr. President, by furthermore reiterating Sierra Leone's call for the immediate cessation of the hostilities and for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, in line with the UN Charter and international law. We urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict, which includes giving due consideration to the legitimate concerns of all involved parties. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Sierra Leone de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Équateur.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Reconozco la presencia del ministro de Relaciones Exteriores de la Federación Rusa, señor Sergei Lavrov. Agradezco por la exposición informativa al señor Adedeji Ebo, adjunto de la alta representante de la Oficina de Asuntos de Desarme de las Naciones Unidas. Saludo la participación de Ucrania. Ecuador ha insistido en señalar que la guerra, la ocupación y la violencia armada son asidero para violaciones y abusos de derechos humanos. El
informe recientemente publicado por la Misión de Monitoreo de Derechos Humanos de las Naciones Unidas en Ucrania revela una escalada alarmante en el número de bajas civiles en dicho país. Solamente entre el 29 de diciembre del 2023 y el 20 de enero del 2024, cientos de civiles fueron heridos o perdieron la vida debido a la intensificación de los ataques con misiles y drones por parte de la Federación Rusa. Las muertes registradas el día de ayer en la ciudad ocupada de Donetsk resaltan nuevamente el dolor y el sufrimiento al que se ven expuestos los civiles. Mi delegación ha reconocido asimismo el derecho inalienable de cada nación a la legítima defensa, conforme al derecho internacional y a la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, incluyendo, por supuesto, su artículo 51. Este principio es un pilar de la convivencia pacífica de las naciones. Reconocemos los riesgos que supone la afluencia a gran escala de armas y municiones, que puede contribuir a posibles escaladas y presenta riesgos de desvío y proliferación, incluso tras la finalización del conflicto. En ese sentido, las medidas para contrarrestar esos riesgos son centrales para la seguridad y estabilidad regionales, para la recuperación tras el conflicto e incluso para la prevención de conflictos en otras regiones. Reiteramos la necesidad de priorizar la protección de civiles y respetar las restricciones impuestas por el derecho internacional humanitario sobre el uso de explosivos en zonas pobladas, así como la destrucción de infraestructura civil indispensable para la supervivencia Cualquier suministro de armas debe efectuarse de conformidad con el marco jurídico internacional aplicable, además de estar sujeto a las garantías que aseguren el respeto a los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución. Por otra parte, reiteramos el llamado urgente a todas las partes involucradas para que garanticen el acceso sin restricciones a los expertos de la Agencia Internacional de Energía Atómica, a todas las áreas de la central nuclear de Zaporilla en Ucrania. Es esencial que se garantice la seguridad y protección de esta planta nuclear y evitar un accidente que tendría consecuencias desastrosas, no solo para Ucrania, sino para la región y el mundo entero. Señor Presidente, Ecuador valora cualquier esfuerzo internacional encaminado a priorizar las negociaciones y la diplomacia. Insistimos una vez más en que se ponga fin a la ocupación y la agresión militar de Rusia contra Ucrania, tal como lo dispuso la Corte Internacional de Justicia el 16 de marzo del 2022. Para dar paso, de esta manera, a una solución pacífica enmarcada en el respeto de los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas.
Représentant de l'Équateur pour sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, President. I thank Mr. Ivo for his briefing. Colleagues, 2 years ago, Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Since its illegal and unprovoked attack, over 300,000 Russian personnel have been killed or wounded. Mothers and wives of these soldiers have been arrested or ignored. Thousands of Russian anti-war protesters have been detained. Media organizations have been shut down, and many journalists are now in Russian prisons. Russian military modernization has been set back 18 years. Now, Russia's defense industry strips down fridges for parts. It orders its weapons from the DPRK, in violation of multiple resolutions agreed in this chamber under this Russian Foreign Minister's instruction. Its purchase and use of Iranian drones involves both states violating a Security Council resolution. And for what? To lose more than half of the land it seized in February 2022 and a fifth of the Black Sea Fleet? To have its economy deprived of over $400 billion by sanctions and hundreds of thousands of young Russians who've emigrated for a better future? This war benefits no one, not Russians, and certainly not Ukrainians. Colleagues, last time the Russian Foreign Minister was here, he spoke of protecting the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine.
Yet the only threat to any civilian in Ukraine continues to come from Russia. Russia continues to impede access for humanitarian organizations to the millions of people in need. The UN Commission of Inquiry has reported a systematic pattern of torture against Ukrainian civilians by Russian authorities. Russian missile strikes continue to strike population centers, with some of the most intense waves yet falling during the new year. And Russia says it wants peace. But while Ukraine, the UK, and around 80 other countries were in Davos last week discussing President Zelensky's plans for peace, based on principles of the UN Charter that all here have signed up to, the deputy head of Russia's National Security Council was proclaiming there could never be peace while an independent state of Ukraine existed. That is not peace. That is subjugation, which would threaten Ukraine's very existence as a state and usher in a new era of global instability. This is why the UK will continue to replenish Ukraine's air defences, to help it shield its civilians from these brutal attacks. This is why we've signed a new long-term agreement on security cooperation and announced £2.5 billion more in military aid and £18 million more in humanitarian aid for Ukraine. Because Ukraine's security matters for global security. President, as my Prime Minister said on his recent visit to Kyiv, we remain unwavering in our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its borders, to ensuring Ukraine's ability to defend itself, to resist future coercion, to choose its own future, and to prosper peacefully. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Royaume-Uni de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Algérie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
I thank the Director at the DG EBO for his briefing. Algeria expresses its deep concern about the increase of hotbeds and tension worldwide, while our collective efforts fails to bring lasting and peaceful solution to conflict. In this complicated juncture, the Security Council, primarily responsible for maintaining international peace and security, shortfalls from fulfilling its mandate. This is mainly due to exacerbation of the phenomenon of polarization, a phenomenon that only contributes to the prolongation of crisis and escalation of tension. Algeria shares the concern regarding the use of weapons and ammunition with increasing lethality and destructive powers. The flow of such weapons and ammunition into conflict area will only increase the loss of lives, prolong the suffering of population, and further hinder the prospect of foreseeable solutions. We call upon all parties to uphold the UN Charter and fully comply with their obligation under international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilian and civilian infrastructure. To alleviate the suffering of people, no effort should be spared. Unfortunately, there is at this moment no effort, no initiative, and no mediation to stop the hostilities. Our focus as a Security Council should be on promoting peaceful solution by creating the condition for inclusive and constructive dialogue. This endeavor must be guided by the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes. Algeria believes that only a just and lasting peace, based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the legitimate security concern of all parties, can resolve the crisis. We also believe that it is paramount to promote and intensify international diplomatic effort to achieve peace, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere in the world. In this juncture, sorry to remind that Palestinian territories should not be the exception. The carnage perpetrated by the occupying power, the killing of 24,000 of Palestinians in Gaza, must also stop now. 24,000 victims in 3 months, comparatively to 10,000 during the war in Ukraine in 2 years. I cannot describe otherwise the horror of killing hundreds of innocent children and women every day in Gaza and depriving an entire population of basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable for their survival. Let us not forget the Palestinians in Gaza. For us, Palestinian lives also matter. I thank you.
Je remercie le
I
représentant de
thank the
l'Algérie de sa
representative of Algeria
déclaration
for
et je
their
donne à
statement.
présent la
I now
parole à la
give the floor
représentante de
to
la
the
Suisse.
representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank
Je
you, Mr.
remercie
President.
aussi
I
Monsieur Ebo, le
also would
haut
like to thank
représentant
Mr.
adjoint
Ebo,
pour les
Deputy
affaires
High
de
Representative
désarmement
for
de son
Disarmament
intervention.
Affairs. I thank him for his
En
contribution.
1956,
In 1956,
le secrétaire général de l'ONU de
the
l'époque,
Secretary General
Dag
of the
Hammarskjöld,
time, Dag
rappelait
Hammarskjöld,
ici, dans cette
reminded
salle,
us here in
que, je
this
cite,
room that,
les
and I
principes
quote,
de la
the
charte
principles
sont
of
de
the
loin
Charter
plus
are
grands
by
que
far
l'organisation qui les
greater than the
incarne et les
organization
buts
in
qui
which
sont
they are
destinés à
embodied and the
sauvegarder
aims
sont plus
which they are
sacrés
to
que la
safeguard
politique
are
d'aucun
holier
peuple
than
ou
the policies
d'aucune
of any
nation.
single nation or people.
L'universalité de ces
The
principes
universality
constitue
of
la
these
colonne
principles
vertébrale du
forms
droit
a backbone
international
of
et
international
des
law
relations entre
and
les
of
peuples et les
relations
nations.
between peoples and nations.
L'un de ces principes
One of these
fondamentaux est
fundamental
l'interdiction du
principles
recours
is
à
the
la force.
prohibition of the use of
L'agression
force.
militaire de la Russie contre
Russia's
l'Ukraine
military
est une
aggression
violation
against
flagrante
Ukraine
de ce
is a
principe
flagrant
que la
violation of
Suisse
this
condamne
principle,
avec la plus
which
grande
Switzerland
fermeté.
condemns in the strongest
Après
possible
presque 2
terms.
ans, les
After almost 2
souffrances
years,
causées par
the
cette guerre
suffering caused
nous
by
rappellent
this
la
war
centralité de la
reminds us
charte
of the
et de ses
centrality of
principes.
the Charter and
Comme
its
l'a dit le
principles.
secrétaire général
As
la
the
semaine
Secretary
passée à
General
Davos, je
said
cite,
last week in
lorsque les
Davos, I
normes
quote,
globales
when
s'effondrent,
global norms
la confiance
collapse,
s'effondre
so
également.
does trust.
C'est pourquoi la
And this
Suisse
is why
exhorte une fois de
Switzerland
plus la
once
Russie
again
à cesser
urges Russia to
immédiatement les
cease
hostilités
hostilities
et à
immediately
retirer ses
and to
troupes du
withdraw
territoire
its
ukrainien.
troops from Ukrainian
L'Ukraine a le
territory.
droit, en vertu de la Charte des
Ukraine,
Nations
under the
Unies,
UN Charter,
d'assurer sa
has the right to
sécurité
ensure
et
its
de défendre
security
son
and
intégrité
defend its
territoriale et sa
territorial
souveraineté.
integrity and sovereignty.
Nous rappelons que le
We
respect des
reiterate that
conventions et
compliance
instruments
with
multilatéraux
multilateral
relatifs aux
conventions and
transferts
instruments
d'armes,
on arms
y compris les
transfers,
résolutions de son
including the
Conseil,
resolutions of this
est
Council,
essentiel.
is essential.
Nous sommes particulièrement
We are
inquiets face
particularly
aux informations
concerned by
selon
reports
lesquelles la Russie aurait
that
reçu des
Russia
armes et
would have
même
received
utilisé les
weapons and
missiles
even
balistiques
used ballistic
de la
missiles
République populaire
from the
démocratique de
Democratic People's
Corée
Republic of
lors des
Korea
récentes attaques.
in the recent
Nous
attacks.
appelons la
We
Russie
call
ainsi
on
que tous
Russia
les autres
and
États
all
membres de
other
l'ONU
UN member
à
states
pleinement respecter
to
leurs
comply
engagements
fully with
découlant
their
des résolutions
commitments under
pertinentes de
relevant
ce
UN
Conseil,
resolutions,
telles que la
such as
résolution
Resolution
1718 interdisant
1718,
tout transfert
prohibiting
d'armes
all arms
depuis et
transfers
vers la
from
RPDC.
and towards the DPRK.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
après presque 2
after
ans
almost
depuis le
2
début de
years
l'agression
since the
militaire,
start of the
la
military aggression,
population
the
ukrainienne compte
Ukrainian
sur la
population
solidarité
is
internationale
relying
pour
on
se
international
chauffer, se loger
solidarity to
et
stay
se
warm,
nourrir.
to have a place to live,
L'intensification
and
inédite
not
des
to go
attaques russes sur les
hungry.
villes et
The
les
unprecedented
infrastructures de tout le pays,
intensification of
dans des
Russian attacks on
conditions
towns and
hivernales
infrastructure
extrêmes,
throughout the
tue des
country in
civils par
extreme winter
centaines
conditions
et
is killing
accentue les
civilians
besoins
by the hundreds
humanitaires.
and is
Nous
accentuating
déplorons également les
humanitarian
attaques sur les
needs.
civils dans
We also
l'est de
deplore the
l'Ukraine
attacks
sous
on
contrôle
civilians
russe,
in
notamment à
Russian-controlled
Donetsk
eastern
ce
Ukraine,
dimanche.
notably
Nous
in
rappelons
Donetsk
que le
on
droit
Sunday.
international
the international humanitarian law must be respected at all times, and the parties to the conflict must ensure the protection of the civilian population and respect the rules governing the conduct of hostilities. We echo the UN's call to meet the needs of Ukrainians inside and outside their country. By 2024, I can assure you that Switzerland will continue to make its contribution. However, as long as the military aggression continues, the suffering will continue as well, and efforts to achieve a just peace in Ukraine must therefore be redoubled. True to our long-standing commitment to peace, we are ready to support any initiative and dialogue aimed at achieving peace in accordance with the UN Charter. The participation of 82 countries and international organizations at the fourth meeting of national security advisors in Davos last week testifies to the growing desire to discuss the principles for restoring lasting peace in Ukraine. We welcome this willingness to work for peace on a trans-regional level. Switzerland wishes to make its contribution in this respect. That's why, at the request of the Ukrainian president, we have committed ourselves to efforts aimed at consolidating a common understanding of the path to lasting peace in Ukraine, shared by the broadest possible representation of countries. In this way, a high-level conference would help lay the foundations for future peace negotiations involving all parties in the spirit of the UN Charter, which calls for the peaceful settlement of disputes. Mr. President, this war ultimately concerns all the signatory states of the Charter, as it is contrary to this universal treaty. As an elected member of the Security Council and beyond, we are deeply committed to the realization of the principles of the Charter and to the protection and restoration of peace on our continent and elsewhere. I thank you. I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Mr. President, I thank Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Adedeji Ebo, for his briefing. Russia has called for these meetings, claiming that Western arms transfers to Ukraine are aggravating the crisis and undermining efforts to achieve a peaceful solution. One loses count of how many times Russia has requested similar Security Council meetings since its aggression against Ukraine began in February 2022, simply for its political purposes. Russia has expressed its concern about the support for Ukraine, which is to assist Ukraine in defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity against. There is no doubt that this support is just and legal under international law. On the other hand, Russia ruthlessly using its own weapons, including those obtained from North Korea against Ukraine, by violating Security Council resolutions, on top of its aggression violating the UN Charter in the first place. Russia has killed so many civilians and then calls for peace without hesitation. Given the countless number of victims and injuries, no reasonable person can be convinced by its words. Accountability remains of the utmost importance. Mr. President, as repeatedly emphasized, this is not merely a European issue. It affects the whole of the international community, including Japan. Russia has been challenging the legitimate international judicial institutions such as the ICC and ICJ, as well as ignoring the voices of General Assembly and people around the world. Its actions shake the very foundation of the international order based on the rule of law. Therefore, this is not about choosing side between Russia and others, nor is it a conflict between the West and Russia, as Russia often claims. In this war of aggression, there are only those who violate the UN Charter and those who defend it. This is an undeniable fact which cannot be changed, no matter what Russia attempts to do. We respect the calls and efforts for peace by many countries. Peace is desired by all. Once again, Japan emphasizes that a just and lasting peace in Ukraine must be based on the UN Charter, and the call for peace should indeed be directed at Russia. Just as Russia initiated this war of aggression, Russia can decide to end it. Mr. President, Japan has experienced many natural disasters and has recently been hit by a major earthquake. We received messages of sympathies and solidarity from all over the world, including from countries in difficult situations such as Ukraine. We are grateful for all of them. The suffering of Ukrainian people is not caused by a natural disaster. The aggression by Russia is an entirely man-made disaster. It can be stopped by Russia. Japan once again urges an unconditional withdrawal from the entire internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. We stand by Ukraine as long as it takes. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie
I thank the representative of Japan for that statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of France. I wish to thank Mr. Ebel for his briefing. Soon it will be 2 years since Russia began flooding us with a whole host of pretexts to justify its war of aggression against Ukraine. But its web of lies disintegrates when faced with the facts. Russia can choose every day and has been able to since the 24th of February 2022 to cease its aggression at no risk whatsoever to its own security. Support being given to Ukraine is no more responsible than Ukraine is for the continuation of the conflict. Our support is provided in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. That support allows Ukraine to defend its territory and its people. The anti-air defense capabilities being provided help Ukraine to protect itself against Russian strikes which target civilians and civilian infrastructure. By training the Ukrainian armed forces, we are helping them to repel the attacks waged by the Russian forces. This support does not aid Ukraine alone. The struggle being waged by the Ukrainian people is also a struggle for our charter and our collective security. It is a struggle to ensure that each and every member state can see its territorial integrity respected without fear of being attacked by a neighbor. Russia continues to fail to heed appeals made to it and continues its illegal war. It does not listen to the ICJ, who on the 16th of March 2022 ordered Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. Neither is Russia listening to the UN General Assembly, who time and time again with an overwhelming majority affirms and reaffirms, indeed it's done so on 4 occasions, its commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. To wage its illegal war, Russia, a permanent member of this council, is acquiring drones from Iran and ballistic missiles from North Korea, and is doing so in violation of this Council's resolutions. In so doing, Russia is weakening our non-proliferation regimes. Russia claims to be concerned with achieving a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In reality, only Ukraine has launched a credible process to work towards a just and lasting peace based on the principles of the United Nations Charter. It has brought a growing number of countries on board with that endeavor. We support Ukraine, and that plan will continue to do so. I now resume my functions as the President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and distinguished members of the Security Council, Deputy to the High Representative. I also recognize here Putin's representative in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. I'm not surprised that the person for whom the Russian ambassador requested this meeting has quickly extracted himself from the chamber. Nevertheless, we acknowledge the importance of the Security Council's platform for documenting the testimonies of modern reincarnation of von Ribbentrop and his henchmen. These testimonies will undoubtedly be used in future trials against war criminals. And the justice will be served, even if now unjust state of affairs is so pervasive. In 1952, Fritz Bauer, who played an essential role in Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, formulated the term Nazi unjust state and tried to enable remembrance and enlightenment in the midst of a justice system that was surrounded, like today in Russia, by a population for whom turning a blind eye, keeping quiet, lying, and brazen awareness of injustice were the order of the day. His credo was, "Nothing belongs to the past. Everything still is present and has the potential to become the future." We reiterate that the Russian war against Ukraine and occupation of the Ukrainian sovereign territories have been and remain the only source of suffering for the civilian population. Only yesterday, Russian army shelled more than 100 Ukrainian cities, towns and villages in 9 regions, from Chernihiv and Sumy to Mykolaiv and Kirovohrad. The most brutal Russian attacks were in Donetsk region. The Russian Federation has initially requested this meeting to discuss the issue of weapon supplies. Indeed, transfers of weapons and military equipment that Russia receives, in particular from Iran and DPRK, continue to fuel the conflict and result in increased toll of casualties among civilian population of Ukraine. The same Fritz Bauer, whom I have already quoted, once told his colleague, and it was some years after the military defeat of the Nazi regime, he said, "As soon as I leave the confines of my office, I'm on enemy territory. When I leave my office here in New York, I'm not on enemy's territory." And prior to the Security Council meeting, the group of the UN member states delivered a joint statement on the matter of the supply to the Russian Federation by some states in violation of the relevant Security Council resolutions of weapon and munition. I'm not alone, as you have seen an hour ago, and I'm not in the enemy territory here in the Security Council. And I invite everyone to read the statement very carefully. And if you like, you can still join the statement. Mr. President, another testimony, or rather full confession, was made last week by certain Medvedev, former Russian president and current Putin's deputy in the Russian Security Council. He openly and honestly outlined in his Telegram channel real goals of the Russian war against Ukraine. That is, to kill all Ukrainians as long as they want to have their own independent country. One can hardly have another perception of the following statement, and I quote, "The existence of Ukraine is fatally dangerous for Ukrainians. They will understand that life with Russia in a large common state, which they do not want very much now, is better than death. Their deaths and the deaths of their loved ones. And the sooner Ukrainians realize this is, the better." This is the manifesto of genocide, plain and simple, that could only be compared to another manifesto written almost 100 years ago and known under the title Mein Kampf. Much has been already said about the fact that Russia's actions and words precisely repeat those of the Nazis. One may find it awkward that Russia accuses others in neo-Nazism to justify its aggression. In fact, that is a psychological phenomenon of projection when own thoughts, feelings, and ideas are attributed to others. Therefore, the catchphrase, "war till the last Ukrainian," which has been used so often by the Russian delegation in this chamber as an accusation, is in fact their keen desire. As follows from the confession by certain Medvedev, they indeed are going to wage a war until last Ukrainian, just because the model of their world does not contain neither Ukraine nor Ukrainians. And this is the only reason for Russia to be so obsessed with both the Ukrainian resilience and the global solidarity with my country. The solidarity that results in particular in supplying weapons to assist Ukraine to exercise our right to self-defense in strict accordance with the Article 51 of the UN Charter. It is imperative to underscore that Russia's determination to inflict harm on Ukrainian civilians has not diminished. On the contrary, it has intensified significantly. Russia has increased number of attacks along with number of missiles launched across Ukraine. And the statistics of victims have decreased because most of Russian missiles do not achieve their targets, solely due to the bolstered air defense provided by our allies. This is what literally saves our children, alongside the evacuation measures implemented by Ukrainian authorities to protect residents in the most dangerous areas. Mr. President, yesterday marked the 100th anniversary since the death of Lenin, another idol of today's Russians, and the leader of Bolshevik coup d'etat in Russia. You may recall how often Putin publicly blamed him for creating Ukraine. It may seem baffling that among the initial actions done by Russian invaders in many occupied Ukrainian settlements were the re-erection of Lenin's monuments. However, this was quite logical as the current Kremlin dictator strives to closely follow in the footsteps of the Bolshevik predecessor, who in reality had a very straightforward maxim that he repeatedly conveyed to his accomplices, and I quote, "If we lose Ukraine, we lose our head," and you lost your head quite so. The colonial and imperial mentality towards Ukraine has always been a hallmark of Russian authorities, whether it be Tsars, Soviet communists, or Putin's criminals. And from their perspective, peace in the current war is a way to lose Ukraine. This is why the Russian Federation so strongly opposes the peace formula implementation. It is rather a rhetorical question: what exactly prompts Russia's objections? The idea of comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, or the fact that this peace should be based on the principles of the UN Charter? And the process, regardless of Russia's sentiments, is very well underway. The fourth meeting of national security and foreign policy advisors on the implementation of the peace formula was held in Davos on the 14th of January. More than 80 states and international organizations participated in the meeting, testifying to the rapidly growing interest for the peace formula. The meeting was focused on discussing the specific points of the peace formula, notable withdrawal of Russian troops and cessation of hostilities, restoration of justice, environmental safety, preventing escalation and repetition of aggression, confirmation of the end of the war. In addition, 2 special sessions were held on food security and humanitarian aspects of the war. As follows from the press communique of the co-chairs, Ukraine and Switzerland, this meeting laid the necessary prerequisites for the preparation of a meeting of leaders of states and governments, which can give a start to a high-level to a high level and establish a common and universal basis for achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine based on the Ukrainian peace formula. It was also emphasized that Ukraine's security is an integral part of world and regional security. Therefore, war against Ukraine remains one of the main destabilizing factors for security in the world. Due to these peace efforts must be significantly strengthened in order to end the war in a just and comprehensive way. The task of the world community shall not only be to end the war, but also to overcome the consequences of all those crises that were caused by it throughout the world. Mr. President, symbolically today, my country marks the Day of Unity. Unity has many dimensions and manifestations. It is the resilience of Ukrainian soldiers defending their native soil from the bloody aggressor. It is a record number of participants in Davos promoting peace for Ukraine. It is solidarity with Ukraine, including here in this chamber. It is an assistance by our allies aimed at enhancing our defense capacities. It is also a shared commitment to the values of democracy, freedom, and justice. I encourage you to be guided by this perception and spirit of unity, as it is essential for the prospects of the efforts to maintain the international peace and security as a whole. And I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant d'Ukraine de sa déclaration. Il n'y a plus d'oratrices ou d'orateurs inscrits sur la liste. La séance est levée.
The meeting is adjourned.
Ça va?